I follow the fighting over God. The new atheists going after the old fundamentalists. Philosophers on each side taking their best shots. Even scientists jumping into the ring. I love it. But not because I like watching gladiators, religious and anti-religious, in immortal combat, but because I want to know if God exists. And if God does exist, what God is like. Yet all the so-called arguments for or against God's existence are predictable and tiresome. So I look beyond. I assume God exists and assess God's nature. Then watch whether contradictions emerge or discern what divine characteristics develop. Does God have a nature? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. To examine God's nature, I should, interrogate God. Since such exceeds my pay grade, I begin in Oxford with the Noloth Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion, Brian Leftow. Brian specializes in divine metaphysics, exploring God's essence and attributes. Brian, does God have a nature or a personality or a kind of a constellation of attributes?
To say that someone has a nature can be taken two ways. First, a nature might be the properties that necessarily make you what you are. Being human is the nature of a human being. It couldn't be something else. Another way in which the phrase nature can be used is in terms of someone's emotional disposition. You might have a dour nature or a friendly nature. It's been standard Western theism that God has a nature in both senses. Another major question that arises here is whether God has his nature or is his nature. There's a strand of thinking coming out of the Middle Ages that says that God is in a certain way simple, that certain distinctions that you find within us aren't found within God. I'm an individual, I have my human nature, it's a property I have. Thomas Aquinas want to say that God isn't really an individual distinct from a nature he has. It's not that God is a person having deity as his nature. God and deity are somehow at a deep level the same thing. If God is completely simple, then there are no distinctions within him at all. So every property God has is identical with God and with God's nature, since God is also identical with his nature. So God's just this completely undifferentiated, simple thing.
Another way to say this is that, does God have parts? Or is God completely homogeneous? It's all exactly the same.
Right. God is simple, therefore he's not complex in any sense, therefore he doesn't have parts in any sense, so it's all completely one. And everything we might want to say about God is somehow just an abstracted aspect from this one simple unity.
So what do you think about divine simplicity?
I would love it to be true. But one problem I have with it is that it's not really clear to me that if God is simple, he can have contingent properties, like the property of knowing that we're here right now, which would seem to be one that he needn't have had. If God is simple, his knowledge that we're here is identical with his very essence, his deity.
So what you're saying, if God is simple, it's everything God knows, not just the fact that he knows everything as a capability, but every single fact of what he knows is part of that same simplicity?
Exactly. The problem is they should be contingent, but if they're identical with all the rest, they can't be, because God is necessarily divine. He has that property necessarily. So if his knowledge that we're here now is identical with that property, he has it necessarily. He necessarily knows that we're here right now.
Which gives us no freedom to have not have been here.
Exactly.
Where do you stop all this?
What God is, his nature is divine. So he necessarily has any properties that go into making him divine. So he's necessarily omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good. On the other hand, He doesn't have to know that we're here now to be divine. He would have been divine even if we had not been here. So that's a contingent property. It's not part of his nature.
And of course, there'd be infinite number of those things. You only listed 3 that you felt were essentially part of God's essential divinity, divine nature.
I'd throw in some others. I mean, I think he has to be free. I think he has to be a spirit. I think it has to be the case that if there's anything other than him, he created it.
So you're up to 6.
Yeah.
But you can basically remain with the fingers of your hands to get all of God's essential necessary properties.
Pretty near.
Is God simple? God's simplicity enhances my sense of what God might be, if there is a God, and even if God is not simple. Is everything in God or of God all the same? Or does God have parts out of which God is composed, like we have cells out of which we are composed? God's simplicity probes the deep essence of God. If God is necessary and self-existing and eternal or everlasting, how could God have any specific number of parts? Why that number? God's simplicity gets under my skin. What is God like? I restrain my critical thinking. I put on the clothes of the scholarly believer, see how I look, sense how I feel. Still in Oxford, I visit a distinguished Anglican philosopher and theologian, Keith Ward.
And I suppose one place to start is where the great traditions start with the apophatic way, or the negative way, what God is not. And to say that God is not like anything that is finite. The Creator is not like anything created. The point is, traditional theologians take the best thing they can think of, which turns out to be the most developed, complex organisms in the universe, human beings, and you take human persons and you say, well, God is not less than that, so God is more than that. So in addition to the way of denial, of saying God is not what you think, you also add, but God is not less than the best you could think. So it's a double process of thinking, well, better than the best, so we start with the best, but much better than the best, so not really very like that. We'll take creativity as one example.
Yes.
We tend to think these days that creativity is a good thing. So you have newness and you have variety and you'd have individuality, all these things. But in early medieval times, for example, people didn't think that. So if you're a very traditionalist person, you might not think creativity was a particularly good thing to have.
So there's a little social construction here?
God isn't a construction, but the idea of God is constructed by us. It's just when you're worshipping God, when you're trying to relate to God, you have to have some image. So the important thing is to see that it's an image. It's not the reality. The idea of God is your construct.
And what about God's different characteristics, that they all sort of blur together in a grand unified theory, so to speak?
One super quality, really.
Yeah.
Which is where I think things have gone wrong, actually, in some traditional theology, is to say, well, goodness must point to the same property as power points to and love points to.
Yes.
So actually there's this one super power. And I think that is making logically tight something which should have been treated at a more metaphorical level. And probably most religious believers have taken the softer, more flexible option. That God's simplicity just consists in the fact you can't pull God apart, and he's not made of simpler bits. He didn't assemble. God was always there. That's the heart of it. But theologians, of course, like most intellectuals, get carried away with their own ideas, and so they get this tighter view of simplicity as meaning no change, no variation, and therefore timelessness, impassibility, inability to suffer or be moved in any way. And that creates, well, a very impersonal view, but also a rather sort of inward-looking God who can't really change even by knowing the universe is there, because it's got to make no difference to God. And some of us feel very dissatisfied with that view.
To Keith, God is known through the tension between two principles: the negative theology of knowing what God is not, and, starting with the best, But knowing God is much better than that. As for divine simplicity, Keith accepts that God is not made of smaller parts, and hence cannot be pulled apart. But he rejects the extreme claim that God has no logical parts. Does God's nature tie us into semantic knots? Is the whole idea of God incoherent? I wander through Oxford's haze with bipolar cycles of thought, exhilarated, appreciating God's essence, depressed, fearing theological mirage. I hear that Oxford professor Bede Rundle, who is an expert on existence, is an atheist.
Bede, can we use the nature of God to discern whether or not that kind of God even makes sense?
I find your initial question slightly curious. Does God have a nature? Because if the term God means anything at all, then when you explain the meaning, you indicate what kind of a being it is, what its nature is. So suppose you had the child asking you, what is God? Then you say, well, he's an all-powerful being who's responsible for the creation of this universe and then other things that you may think apps to put in. So you can't turn around after all that and say, but he doesn't have a nature. Part of it is his being omnipotent and omniscient and so forth. And so the focus becomes on the other point that you're concerned with, the coherence of the nature as so defined.
So what are traditional aspects of his nature, and do they cohere together?
Well, he's thought to have, roughly speaking, anything that we would regard as a virtue or as some sort of desirable attribute. Virtues can be problematic because they're usually ascribed to beings who act in a certain way, and if God acts, then it's only, if you like, incidentally that he does. He is eternally wise and just, merciful, all-knowing, all-powerful. And so one question you might examine is, well, how can we connect up the various attributes of God? I mean, the sort of thing I'm thinking of is, well, if he is omnipotent, does that imply that he's omniscient, that he knows everything? And the answer would seem to be yes, because a being who can do anything at all can in particular answer any question at all. So here you'd say, look, we've established a link between these two. Now, how do they relate to perfection? Well, once more you'd say they must be an integral part of being perfect. A being which was wanting in these respects couldn't be described as perfect. So you would set to work to try and make more of a system out of the concepts which go to define what God's nature is. And of course, at the end of this, your question, but is there any being that answers to that description, is the interesting one, which is not answered by this.
Can you imagine a possible being that indeed has that constellation of attributes?
Well, there's an interesting sort of contrast here. The argument which moves most people towards acceptance of God is the argument from design. The argument that turns them away from God is the problem of evil.
Yes.
And that involves consistency in certain attributes. So if God can do anything at all and knows about everything, then surely he can put an end to all the needless suffering that men and animals generally undergo. So that would be a case where the question of the coherence of the description is at stake. It's an interesting intellectual exercise to piece the jigsaw pieces together and see if you've got a coherent whole, but then I think that's where things end, because you don't get beyond the definition to a reality.
To Bede, one obvious contradiction in God's nature is the problem of evil. But the larger question is, irrespective of God's characteristics, is there a real being called out by them? What's driving my desire to know, or even care? Misdirected evolutionary psychology? or sensing actual transcendence. How else to approach God? What about this medieval idea that God can be known only in the negative? That we can never know what God is, only what God is not? Is this clever rationalization? Since we don't know God, we can't know God. Knowing God only in the negative appears in many religions, in Judaism and Islam, as well as in Christianity. For the Jewish view, I go to New York, to Yeshiva University, to meet a rabbi who is also a philosopher, David Shatz.
I'm going to set out for you a debate between, on the one hand, Moses Maimonides, the greatest, most important, certainly of Jewish philosophers in the 12th century, and then Levi Gersonides in the 13th century, who was a philosopher of extraordinary subtlety and pointedness. Maimonides' view went something like this, that there are two sets of attributes that God has. Some of them are described in the Bible, he says, as psychological attributes. So, for example, there are 13 attributes of God that were revealed to Moses, and among them were he's compassionate, he is gracious. Now, Maimonides believed that God cannot have emotional states, because to have emotional states is to change. He accepted the prevailing philosophical view of the time that change represents a deficiency. So the way he understood these psychological characteristics is that God does the actions such that if a human being were to do those actions, we would attribute to their mental state or their heart or whatever. But the difference between them is that God produces the action without the mental state. Maimonides also, though, said that there are other kinds of attributes of God. God is knowing, God is powerful, God is incorporeal, God exists. These he analyzed very differently. When it comes to these other predicates, Maimonides adopted something that's called a negative theology. And the idea behind it is that if you say, for example, that God is knowing, what you mean is that God is not knowing. In other words, God is not ignorant. Now, anybody hearing this is going to ask the question, well, isn't that the same thing?
Right.
He says that when we negate these predicates, what we mean by this is what we mean when we say, quote, the wall does not see. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's compare two sentences. John Milton does not see. The wall does not see. When you say John Milton does not see, what you are saying is he's the sort of entity, let's call it, that could see, but in fact he doesn't. When you say the wall does not see, you mean that the whole category of sight and blindness do not apply to a wall. So really, ultimately, what are you doing? You're saying, well, God is knowing equals God is not ignorant, but what you're really saying by that is that the entire human category of knowledge and ignorance doesn't apply. The upshot of this really is that we don't know what God is because he escapes all our categories. Now, Gersonides thought that this view is really in the wrong direction, and he had some very, very pointed criticisms. One point he makes is that if this is the way you're going to look at what these attributes mean, so for example, you say God is knowing means the whole category of ignorance and wisdom doesn't apply, what difference does it make where you start? I could just as well start from God is ignorant, God is weak. It makes no difference because you're going to wind up in the same place, that is negating the entire category. Where Gersonides ends up is that God does have the attributes that human beings have, but he has them to a much greater degree. He is knowing, we are knowing. He knows an awful lot more than we know. He is a lot more powerful than us. So in that sense, there's a difference between his attributes and ours. But it's a difference of degree.
Not in kind.
It's not a difference of kind.
God escapes all our categories. I like that, David. But if true, as you said, then we can't even ask whether God exists. Seems circular, don't you think? If I'm trying to interrogate God, as it were, I'm not getting very far. But oddly, I have a magical sense of confidence that I now see, however darkly, the mysterious landscape of God's nature. I'm now prepared to speak with the modern philosopher most identified with God's nature. I go to Notre Dame to meet Alvin Plantinga.
On the one hand, if you're a believer in God, you think God should be sovereign and should have aseity. You could call that the sovereignty aseity intuition. And if you take that really seriously, then you would say, well, God can't be limited by anything at all, and so he shouldn't be limited even by the laws of logic, and so he can create married bachelors, or make it the case that 2 + 3 = 7, or make it the case that he knows that he doesn't exist. And then on the other hand, there's the intuition that that doesn't even make sense. That's just not even in any sense at all possible. And I guess the question is, which of these two intuitions is the stronger? I guess my own inclination is to go the second way, not the first way. It seems to me more obvious that it doesn't even make sense to suggest that God might know that he doesn't exist than it is to think that if God is sovereign and has aseity, then he's got to be able to even violate the laws of logic. To be worthy of worship, what would a being have to be like? God would have to be a greatest possible being. And the greatest possible being, I guess, would have to be one who is all-powerful and all-knowing and morally perfect, wholly good, and maybe other things as well. But not only would such a being have to have those properties, as a matter of fact, this being would have to be such that it couldn't fail to have these properties. And if God does have those properties necessarily, well, then there are certain things that not even he can do. He can't bring it about that he doesn't have them, for example. So he can't divest himself of his omnipotence or omniscience or goodness.
What does it mean to say that God is simple?
There's no composition in God of any kind. So there's no composition of thing and property. We ordinarily think that you and I are things, and we've got properties. We've got the property of being here right now. We've got the property of being human beings, the property of knowing certain things. But we, of course, are not the same thing as those properties. Well, Aquinas suggested this in this classical doctrine that there isn't that kind of composition in God either. So God has to be identical with his properties. It seems to follow from that each of his properties has to be identical with each of his other properties. Because if one thing A is identical with something B, then anything else identical with A is also identical with B. So omnipotence would have to be the same property as omniscience. Aquinas seems to think that it's because if there were a distinction between God and his properties, then there are these two parts to God which could, so to speak, fall apart, and then God wouldn't exist. But God's a necessary being. It can't be that he doesn't exist.
These different properties that God has, are all of them necessary, or only a few necessary and some are just happen to be that way, contingent, as we say?
I would say the latter. I would say that God has many properties that he does not have essentially. He has the property of having created human beings, but he didn't have to. It's not that he couldn't possibly have refrained from doing that. So I would say God has many properties contingently, but then also many properties essentially, like being omnipotent and omniscient and completely good and a creator of whatever there is, and so on.
In exploring God's nature, I have two pursuits. First, to seek contradictions, which, if not refuted, would deny God's existence. Second, if God does exist, to discern traits of such an incredible being. I'm taken by negative theology. God escapes all our categories. But I fear that's because the whole idea of God is flawed. Divine simplicity means that God would have no parts. He could not be pulled apart or built up from smaller components. But God would have separate properties. Some would be necessary, like being all-powerful and all-good. These could not have been otherwise. And some would be contingent, like creating the universe. These could have been otherwise. Now about those contradictions. The problem of evil is a high hurdle for an all-powerful, all-good creator. Even if there is no God, God's nature takes us closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.